Alright guys, Murph's here. And today, at viewer request, we're going to discuss some non-standard pistol defensive cartridges for predator defense. Alright, so in order to be able to get into the subject, we are going to have to go ahead and get a couple of caveats and definitions out of the way, starting off with definitions. What am I defining as dangerous game or predatory game in this case? Well, I kind of put them on a spectrum with three different layers to it. So layer number one would be like coyotes and wolves, kind of at the light end of the spectrum. Light, not in that they're not dangerous, or light in that, wolves are small, because they're not. Light in terms of it's not going to take a substantial cartridge to be able to put these animals down. You might need a lot of them depending on how many there are. And while the wolf population is not such that it's incredibly detrimental to humans, wolves are still incredibly dangerous. They're still wild animals, and they're definitely still predatory. And coyotes, though coyote attacks are rare, they're not unheard of. Generally against small children, though I'm sure given the right set of circumstances, a couple of them would be more than willing to take on a man. So that's the light end of the spectrum. The middle ground are the big cats. In this case, I'm talking more about like mountain lions and stuff like that. A bobcat's pretty small. They're not necessarily terribly predatory against humans. They might be territorial against humans, and that's about the closest that you might get. For the most part, I mean, if you know a cat well enough to call it Bob, how dangerous can it really be? But mountain lions, pumas, whatever else, in that kind of weight range, those are potentially very dangerous to humans as well. So that's kind of like your middle ground. That culminates with black bears. Now, I, in the past, have joked that, black bears are nothing but big old teddy bears, and that's definitely not true. A black bear will most definitely mess you up if given the opportunity, but they are kind of also the smallest of the bears, at least in North America, which we are talking about North American game in this case. If I expanded this to Africa, we'd be having a completely different conversation, let alone Australia, where, just everything is looking to kill you anyway. It's all predatory, including the fauna and the flora. Anyway. The high end of this is brown bears and the Kodiaks, as well as, grizzlies and polar bears, as well as some of your larger cloven hoof game like moose, elk, caribou, so on and so forth. A moose is not going to pursue you for miles to eat you, but a moose might very well stomp you just because you got in its way. Moose, caribou, elk can be very territorial, and especially if you're pursuing wounded game, might just turn around and decide to make something of it. So people get injured every year by these animals. It's kind of like whenever you see videos of like some tourists walking up to a bison, and of course it's like a white lady or something like that, and this bison just absolutely bounces them when they're sitting there thinking they're just going to go pet the big woolly cow. Like, it's not the case. These are still dangerous. These are still wild animals that have wild instincts, and you have to keep that in mind whenever it is that you're dealing with them. So in this case, we're talking about non-standard options. What do you mean non-standard options, Murph? Well, a lot of times whenever it is that you talk about predator defense, predatory game defense, you hear people like maybe at the low end start with like 45, like a very hot hard cast 45 ACP, and then maybe they culminate like 44 Magnum or 500 Smith & Wesson, something along those lines. But there's a lot of other options that are available, 454 Casull, 480 Ruger, 475 and 500 Line Boss, so on and so forth. This viewer specifically wanted to look at semi-automatic cartridge options that meet the same specifications and requirements while still being commercially produced ammunition. That's what we're going to get into here in a minute as I continue to clarify things as we go. Now, why pistol cartridges over rifle cartridges in this case? This is something that's discussed a lot because you might be in a circumstance where either your rifle is inaccessible or a rifle or shotgun did not apply. So, situations where it may not be accessible. You could very well be on a hunt, rifle hunt for whatever type of game animal, and you stop to take a pee, or you're doing like camp type things, and then a predatory animal shows up and you don't have access to your rifle in that moment. Having a handgun available is incredibly important. And there are a variety of tasks or occurrences that can happen in field that you may not have access to your ready access to your rifle. In addition to that, if you're doing things that aren't hunting, hiking, just bebopping around property in a place where dangerous game exists, or if you're like fishing or something along those lines, you got your fishing pole, your tackle, and all that kind of stuff, and all of a sudden Mr. Grizz shows up and he wants that salmon that you just caught. And you know what? While he's at it, you look like a pretty tasty snack as well. You have something available to be able to take that animal down at that point in the form of a convenient handgun. Now, of course, a rifle cartridge would be preferred. We're going to wind up coming back to that before this conversation's all said and done. But there are plenty of circumstances where a rifle does not apply and the convenience of a handgun is more important. Now, last thing I want to get into as far as caveats are concerned, guys, this is not a full-on cartridge discussion video for any of the cartridges that we're about to discuss. This is just supposed to be kind of a Cliff Notes deal, a flyby or anything along those lines. So I'm not getting into like full-on history and comparison and all those types of things. If that's something you're interested to, go ahead and let me know in the comments section, and I am more than willing to meet whatever request it is that you make. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers caveats. Why don't we go ahead and get into what it is that we're talking about today? The viewer requested that I discuss 4 cartridges and then a concept. The 4 cartridges being 460 Rowland, 7.5 FK, 9x25mm Dillon, and 45 Super, with a discussion at the end covering like PCCs and very small, compact, potent guns like Mossberg Shockwave, Cerebree Shorty, so on and so forth. Kind of your like AOWs or your non-standard weapon systems that manage to pair compact capabilities with massive fight-stopping capabilities. So, with that, why don't we go ahead and get into the 460 Rowland. The 460 Rowland is a lengthened 45 ACP, and it is lengthened so that it cannot be chambered into a standard 45 ACP handgun because the 460 Rowland achieves 44 Magnum ballistics. And your Springfield Armory 1911 is probably not going to handle that in a standard chamber. Now, the 460 Rowland is not necessarily a handgun that's produced, or a gun that's produced by any single manufacturer, as much as it's a drop-in kit. So you get a barrel spring, other associated parts, and then you take whatever 45 chambered handgun that you have and you drop those parts in, and now you have a 460 Rowland. You are also able to run 45 ACP through those 460 Rowland barrels, though a couple things to keep in mind. One, because there's a massive pressure difference between the 45 ACP and the 460 Rowland, you're probably going to have some malfunctions on that spring, because that's just, you're shooting lighter loads at that point, almost like PUD loads at that point. And 2, you're going to want to really clean your chamber because there's a slight dimensional difference between the 2 cartridges. The 460 Rowland is incredibly interesting to me because I could take something as light as like a, like a Glock 21 or Glock 30 or something along those lines and drop these parts in and have a very handy, lightweight gun that helps soak up some of its own recoil with a spring system instead of being like a revolver where I just take it all straight into the hand. In addition to that, whenever it is that we talk about like 44 Magnum specifically, since we're getting 44 Magnum ballistics, generally I associate 44 Magnums with very large frames, like the Smith & Wesson L frame in the Model 29, the Ruger Red Hawk and Super Red Hawk, the Colt... Oh man, I just had the Colt... Anaconda, there we go. All of those are very large frame pistols. Now, Smith & Wesson and Taurus and a couple other manufacturers do have lightweight options available. You have the Smith & Wesson Model 329 PD and the Smith & Wesson Model 69. Now, the 69 achieves lightweight and small package and all that kind of stuff by having a 5-shot cylinder, whereas the 329 PD is a 6-shot cylinder and is in the Scadnium family of Smith & Wesson revolver products. It is incredibly lightweight. It is also beating itself to death with every round you fire, and it has a service life before it has to be sent into Smith & Wesson for servicing. So to keep in mind with that. Diminished capacity, all those types of things. You take a Glock 21, drop in all those parts, get the 460 Rowland, now you have standard Glock 21 capacity of 13+1 in 44 Magnum. The only other semi-automatic handgun that quickly comes to mind is the Desert Eagle in 44 Magnum, and that's not going to have the same capacity and is a boat anchor of a gun, whereas the Glock 21 is an incredibly convenient weight. You can do this with an FNX 45, you can do this with 1911s if you so choose, but I feel like going with an FNX 45 or a Glock 21 is where this cartridge would really thrive. So, something to keep in mind there. Though I have seen a lot of issues with FNX 45s and reliability, something to keep in mind. Okay. Of the options that we discussed here today, the 460 Rowland, and this is kind of like bottom line up front, is kind of my favorite. I think it's a very neat option, especially to be able to pair it with things that already exist. Now, there's also a 960 Rowland, which we're not going to get into other than to identify that it exists because I did not know that there was such a thing. So that might be news to you as well. Next, we're going to get into the 7.5 FK, which is a cartridge that was developed for the FK BRNO, hereafter referred to as Burno, field pistol. There's a couple of things that interest me about this overall concept here. First off, the field pistol is absolutely massive. It kind of reminds me of the HK Mark 23, which when that was in service, when you added its suppressor and a light or a laser, that was a dedicated primary weapon system for its user. Now, I'm sure in the field, the user probably brought an MP5 because who wants to only fight with a 45 caliber handgun? That doesn't sound very fun to me, but doctrinally, that was how it was supposed to be employed. And the field pistol kind of gives me that same vibe with its size and all that kind of stuff. That's going to play a part here coming up. But also, the 7.5 FK is incredibly interesting to me because it kind of reminds me of the 5.7 by 28, which was designed with a very specific set of parameters, which if you're interested in the 5.7 by 28 discussion, I have done a cartridge discussion video on it previously, link in the description. Now, that cartridge was supposed to be able to penetrate armor and, you know, have flat shooting trajectory after 200 meters and all this kind of stuff. The 7.5 is a completely homegrown design that is meant to be able to hunt game out to 150 meters. With that, you have a 96 to 101 grain projectile moving at 2,000 feet per second, generating 800 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle and over 500 foot-pounds of energy at 100 meters. That is insane. You have 357 Magnum ballistics at 100 meters out of a handgun. Now, in my opinion, we're kind of flirting on the edge of efficacy or ethics of the cartridge at anything beyond that, just because you're talking about engaging with a handgun out to those distances. So being able to actually like have proper shot placement for ethical hunting practices is going to be pretty questionable at that point. I would say that it's good on a man-sized target out to 150 yards, so 150 meters. Like that is something that I think would be acceptable. Okay. With this gun size, I would not consider this to be a backup gun for a hunter, because especially if you're talking about potentially dealing with dangerous game, predatory game, you're probably in fairly rough terrain to begin with, and you're really already counting the ounces because ounces equal pounds and pounds equal pain. So it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to me to give up a lot of your weight savings to a large gun like the field pistol. I could see that either being a guide gun for a backup type situation or just as a dedicated hunting gun on like deer size game out to 100 yards. That's where I think this pistol would actually like really thrive. I don't know if it would be a go-to like, oh, I'm gonna go hiking, because once again, ounces and pounds and all that kind of stuff, but fishing or something along those lines, I could see it being applicable. I could see it being more of a just-in-case type of setup or a dedicated hunting setup, less of a this is in addition to whatever rifle it is that I'm carrying on this hunt. Alright guys, why don't we go ahead and talk about the 9x25mm Dillon. Now this is very interesting because it was actually developed for IPSC. IPSC, amongst all of its other divisions and all that kind of stuff, is broken up into major and minor power factor. And major and minor power factor is not just determined by caliber, but it's also determined by like velocity and mass and all those types of things. You're supposed to have an equation that at one time was supposed to equate to 175 for power factor. Now, 40 Smith & Wesson, 45 ACP, 10mm readily make themselves available for meeting major power factor, but you could, with the right combination of everything, get 38 Super up to that point as well. Somebody decided that they wanted to kind of double dip, because of course if we're talking about 10mm, 40, 45, we're talking about lower capacities and potent cartridges. So by having lower capacities, you wind up having to do more mag changes, and a mag change takes infinitely more time than a miss, unless you stack up a whole bunch of misses. And this is a case if you can't miss fast enough, but the time that it takes for you to be able to slap in a full mag is more time than it takes for you to be able to recover from a miss. By hundredths of a second maybe, but still, a reload is slower than a recovery. So with that being the case, especially if you're talking about like potent cartridges and all that kind of stuff, somebody got the bright idea of taking a 10mm and necking it down to 9mm. So kind of like a souped up, like really long 357 SIG at that point. And now you were able to launch a 100 to 130 grain projectile up to 1,700 feet per second. even going with one of the heavier loads that's likely going a little bit slower, meeting major power factor, you would still have more rounds, less mag change, flatter shooting trajectory, which ideally shouldn't be an issue in most pistol competitions, while maybe still having the same snap. I don't know. I don't have any personal experience with really any of these cartridges to be able to determine one way or the other. But it was a very popular cartridge for a little while, up until major power factor was lowered to 165, at which point the 9x25 started to see itself out. This is interesting because we're getting kind of like 357 Magnum ballistics at that point. So where do I think this cartridge performs at? Well, this performs up to that middle ground that we were talking before, topping out at Black Bear. Now, with the right loads, some sort of hard cast bullet, you could take on larger game with the 9x25. What I'm going to implore you to keep in mind at that point, though, is that shot placement is critical. We're not talking about center mass. What I'm talking about is going for shoulders so that those hard cast bullets can get in there and break those bones. Because if it can't walk, it can't get to me to eat me. This would also be a great option for a coup de grace on like an elk or something along those lines. So that's something that you're considering as being like your primary use for it. A 9x25 is going to perform just fine. Of course, it's going to also perform pretty expensively. But if you wanted to, you could hand load for it pretty easily. Easily, as I understand it, and I'm no hand loader, but it's a pretty steep neck on the 9x25. Okay, that's the 9x25 done. What about the 45 Super? Is this just a souped up 45? Kind of. One of the issues with the 45 ACP is that it's a very low pressure cartridge because it was developed at a time prior to modern propellants. It comes close on the heels on the advent of smokeless powder, and is a very early smokeless powder semi-automatic pistol cartridge, which is characterized as being fairly low pressure, which is great because 45 ACP handguns are basically unkillable. They'll last forever. But it's not that great if you're wanting to really spike the velocities and all that kind of stuff. The cartridge itself was designed with a relatively thin wall, which means that you wind up with case head separation if you try to spike the pressures too fast. The 45 Super corrects this by being produced standard with a thicker cartridge casing, which then, when paired with higher pressure loads, will achieve up to 300 feet per second faster than your standard loading. So, say 230 grain standard pressure 45 ACP goes at 850 feet per second. I put that same 230 grain projectile onto a 45 Super, and I can achieve 1150, which is beyond plus P loads at that point. That's very interesting. I do still think it puts it at the minimum category for performance, but it's something that you can take a standard pistol with no modifications and run it. But there's a couple things you have to keep in mind, and this is something that's discussed when the 45 Super comes up. You want to make sure you have a fully supported chamber. Now, what does that mean? A fully supported chamber has chamber all the way around the cartridge, going pretty much all the way back to the case lip, and with enough space on the case lip exposed so that it can still be grabbed by the extractor. Guns like Glocks don't have fully supported chambers. Hand loaders lament this because whenever they try to like really beef up their loads and stuff like that, they wind up with a bulge right in front of the case head, and that is because there's no support there. Those pressures are causing that cartridge case to expand in that spot specifically and potentially burst if you were to push it far enough. In the case of a 45 Super, you want to make sure that you have a fully supported chamber. And there are a couple of manufacturers that claim that their handguns will stand up to 45 Super no problem. Most notable of which is Heckler & Koch. And that's not a surprise because like the USP and the HK45 and all of their barrels are made from like vibranium or something. They are metal that was harvested from like a meteorite, and they are just ridiculously overstrength. They're cannon grade steel, and you just can't kill them. I'm pretty sure the only way to kill an HK barrel is to like cast it into the fires from which it was forged. So, all right, guys, that's the 45 Super. Now let's go ahead and talk about like PCCs or any of these like super compact, very powerful guns. Mossberg Shockwaves, Serbu Shorties, Pistol Grip Mossberg 500, so on and so forth. In the chamberings that we just discussed, there's not a lot of guns that are necessarily designed for them. You can get a version of the Ruger LC carbine you can get the kit to be able to outfit a Ruger LC carbine chambered in 45 ACP over to 460 Rowland. So that's interesting. That's pretty cool. But nothing else really stood out to me from like the 9x25 Dillon or anything along those lines. You, I guess, in theory, should be able to utilize the same features that you would use for like Glock 21 in perhaps a Chris, but that's kind of what you have to do at that point. I didn't see anybody necessarily like advertising that they had barrels for it. 45 Super, same kind of deal. If you had a fully supported chambered whatever, you should be able to run it through it. Maybe a UMP. I don't know. I didn't look that far into it. And then, of course, you could just go with a Chris in like 10 millimeter, or any of these other types of like CMMGs that are chambered in 45 or 10 millimeter and all that kind of stuff, and run more potent loads out of those. You could absolutely do that. Same thing with the Mossberg 590 Shockwave or Mossberg 500 pistol grip or a Super Shorty. Like, you can run slugs, you can run buck, you get a lot of options there. However, here's my issue with these ideas. If I'm going to the size and weight of a PCC to where I no longer have a holster to put it into, to where I'm having it slung, to where it's potentially getting leaned against a tree while I take a leak, or it's not going to be immediately next to me conveniently as I'm doing like camp chores or something along those lines, they're really not that helpful. At that point, you might as well have a rifle. And even the Serbu Shorty, same type of deal. Like, I guess you could have some sort of like thigh setup for a Serbu Shorty, but a handgun would still be a lot more efficient and would still be a lot better for that type of setup. The moment that you start having to mess around with a sling or like some sort of sheath or scabbard to go on your backpack or something along those lines, you might as well have a 30-06. So, in my opinion, when it comes to PCCs, I don't think they're as applicable in this circumstance as either a handgun or a rifle. I think it's far more binary in that. Now, your situation may be different, and perhaps that's something that you keep in your car as available for that type of application. In that case, a PCC, especially a 3 points of contact pistol, would make a lot of sense. However, that is not nearly as accessible as a handgun will be, and doesn't, a handgun wouldn't involve me, hopefully, having to run back to my car to get it, because now I have to outrun the bear, as well as being able to open my door under duress, get the gun out of whatever it's in and into action. Like, there's a whole lot of steps that's involved in that. They don't necessarily make that a tenable nor good long-term solution. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. Who guessed found this interesting? That's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.